This is Chaz Estrada with True Heat Solutions out in Southern California, and you're listening to the world's #1 pest control training podcast, the Pest Geek Podcast, with Frank Hernandez.
This edition of the Pest Geek Podcast is brought to you by Pest Routes. Pest Routes, supercharge your company with Pest Routes, the #1 pest control software to help you dominate your goals. Visit them at pestroutes.com and get your free demo.
Pull out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your pest geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube, we're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Stephen Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. Stephen Van Tassel here, wildlife control consultant, bringing you another podcast here about doing wildlife control as part of your pest control business. Wanted to talk today about pricing. This is one of the most difficult elements for people getting involved in wildlife control. And I also think in terms of business in general, particularly when you're in a service business, what do you charge and how do you price yourself so that you're not out of the market, but that you make sure you're not hurting yourself in the long run? Because one of the things that a lot of people who are starting a business or don't understand is that how expensive it is to run a business. A lot of people think, oh, you're a business owner, you're making all this money, and people really don't understand until they do it how much it costs to run a company that's legitimate. I mean, there's a lot of illegitimate companies out there doing things under the table. I'm talking about a legitimate company where you are abiding by the laws and regulations of the land and paying your taxes. All right, so let's talk about how do you go about structuring your pricing schedule. So let me give you some principles here on how to move forward with this. Number one, you need to kind of figure out what you think you're worth on an hourly basis. So if you think you're worth $25 an hour, then you're going to be earning on a 40-hour week basis, 50 weeks a year, you're going to be making around $50,000 a year. But understand that that's your hourly wage after taxes and expenses, not how much you need to charge. So the rule of thumb that I give people, when you factor in your benefits, your retirement, your insurances, you're going to need to be charging a lot more than that. My rule of thumb is 50% more. So you would need to charge at a rate of around $50 an hour to achieve a $25 an hour rate, because there's some overhead involved. So when your employer pays you $25 an hour or $15 an hour, whatever it is, understand that it's costing your employer Social Security tax. He has to pay half of that. He has to pay for the liability insurance for you. He has to pay, sometimes you pay for licenses. He'll have to pay for equipment, advertising costs, yada, yada, yada. All that ultimately is paid by you. You just don't think it's paid by you because you just see your salary, but he's actually building all that in to his pricing of the customers. You have to do the same thing. So again, the rule of thumb, and you can tweak this a little bit more when you start getting to more competitive areas, but your rule of thumb should be whatever hourly rate you want to make, double it, and that's what you need to kind of be your operating charge for a customer. So that's all that gives us is an hourly rate. The problem is when we're in a service business, people really get scared when you charge an hourly rate. It's not like hiring a plumber. people want to get a price of what it's going to cost because they don't want to be paying forever. So how do you do that? So here's what you have to do. Once you have an idea of what your hourly rate is going to be, you then need to calculate how long does it take you to do the job. Now, when you're starting out, it's like you don't have any numbers to work with, right? You have to figure out what's it really taking you to do this job. So what you want to do is you want to get into your truck, drive up to your house, and then as soon as you park the vehicle, start a timer. There's a lot of apps on you can use here. If you have a cell phone, there's an app on that where you can just simply do a timer and start timing yourself. That when you get out of the vehicle, then you want to go through the process of filling out the paperwork. How would you start filling out the paperwork for the job? You come out of your vehicle, you pull the ladder off the truck, you're timing yourself in all of this. Do it on your own house, and then time yourself. What is it going to take you to pull that ladder off, throw it up on the roof, do a thorough inspection of that particular property? Just sort of give yourself an animal. Let's say, all right, it's going to be, I'm doing squirrels or so. Okay. Squirrels can be a little time intensive, because you often have ladder work involved with squirrels. So we'll start with squirrels. Throwing that ladder up. How long is it going to take you now to go grab the traps out of the back of your vehicle, put the traps up appropriately on the house, and do it? I would encourage you to do it. You don't have to screw everything down. You can, fudge things a little bit, but you want to get a very clear idea of how much time you need to spend on scene to do the job right. And then take your ladder down, put it back onto the truck, fill out your paperwork. Consider how long you would typically be talking with a client. And I want to caution you here, you're often talking with a client longer than you think, because you may be done with your job and your client just wants to chat and talk about the squirrel that they caught that their uncle dealt with 20 years ago and what a fiasco it was, or maybe he shot it, or whatever the case may be, or they're complaining about how much you're charging. Who knows? I mean, people just like to yak before they write the check. But you need to compensate for that. I would suggest at least 15 minutes is what you should probably think about how long it's taking you with the client on scene, understanding it may be more. And then you have to factor in, did you need to go into the attic? Now notice I didn't mention that because generally speaking, I don't recommend wildlife control operators doing work from inside the structure. However, there are cases when you aren't able to identify where that opening is on the house from the outside of the structure that you have to sometimes go inside the structure in order to check the attic or certain crawl spaces to see where that entry point is. I like working on the outside of a building simply because you don't have to rely on the customer being home to access your traps. But you still need to compensate yourself for those types of situations. They're not going to be that often, but you want to think about 10% of the time you're going to need to go into that attic. And if you're in a part of the country where that's expected of you, or some people don't think you've done your job unless you've inspected the attic, then you're going to need to make sure you compensate for that as well, and including cleanup. All right. So now you have that time on scene, but you're still not done. So I would encourage you to get a little spreadsheet or a long piece of paper, and you'd want to start putting some different columns in, what your hourly rate is. And then, of course, time on scene for squirrel job initial setup. How much time is that going to be? Then you want to think about the cost of getting your materials, like contracts. What's it going to cost you to get a contract? What's that contract going to cost for that client? I used to use contracts they were sort of carbonless paper. What's it going to cost you to get that? This is where you need to call your printing company and say, all right, what's it cost to print 500 contracts, with carbonless paper, and then you would say, okay, and so whatever, let's say the cost is $75. Well, then $75 divided by 500 gives you a price for that particular contract. And so you want to kind of break it down. The more precise you are, the better you're going to be able to determine what your pricing structure is so that you're not losing money at the end of the day. Now, so you have to factor in that. What's a business card going to cost you? All right, you're going to hand your client a business card. Then you have to think about your telephone. If you have a business line, what's that going to cost you on a monthly basis? You need to think about if you have a PO box, what's that going to be costing? Now you say, well, how do I itemize that for a particular client? Well, you have to kind of say, estimate how many clients you think you're going to have in your first year. If you have a little bit of a track record, you divide that out. And so each client is paying a piece of all that, right? So this can get quite detailed. And I understand a lot of people in wildlife control are not detailed people, but you want to crunch those numbers so you have a real accurate notion. So you think about those types of costs. Now, on the bigger side of things, you need to be thinking about, all right, how long is it going to take me? What's going to be my service area? Wildlife control work is incredibly time intensive. You have to be paid for your windshield time. And so you want to try to have an idea of what your working area. My rule of thumb that I tell people in the business is, generally speaking, a half an hour radius from your home base, wherever that home base is. Get a map out and calculate how long does it take you to get from point A, your home base, out to 30 minutes. Where can you get in 30 minutes? That assumes busy traffic. Okay, whatever your traffic is on a normal basis, that's where your 30-minute limit is. And then you draw that circle around that area, or if it's a circle, or if it's a strange polygon, or whatever the case may be, you need to have an idea of how you're calculating that out, marking it down. That is your prime service area. So now, half an hour so your half an hour drive time has to be calculated into that initial visit. And actually, it's an hour, right? Because it's a half an hour out, half an hour back. You can say, well, you may be doing other jobs out there. Well, that's fine, but you still need to be thinking about you won't always have that. So you're calculating how much that time is. Now, how many miles is that? So how are you calculating the cost of your vehicle? Now, when you start getting higher into your business, it's going to be wise for you to do actual cost for your truck. So you'd have a designated business truck that you would do actual cost. However, when you're starting, or as a rule of thumb for how to compensate for calculating purposes, you need to rely on what the federal government allows you to deduct for mileage. And this year, in 2018, if memory serves, it's 54.5 cents a mile. So in 10 miles, you're able to do $5.45. Now understand, that number that the government gives you for deduction on your income taxes for business expenses, that number is designed to cover the cost of your fuel, cost of your maintenance, cost of your insurance, and the cost of replacement of your vehicle. So a lot of people get really caught up in the early parts of their business because they donate their truck that they've already paid for to the business, and then they think, wow, I'm making all this money, and they forget that's not all profit because they forgot about the amount of money that they were supposed to be putting aside to replace the equipment, the capital expense of their equipment. So you have to be sure when you're seeing that money you're taking out to take for your for your vehicle expenses, some of that is for capital replacement, because you're going to need money to replace that truck. Your truck wears out over time. Now, trucks today are certainly lasting longer than they were back in the 70s, but the reality is you still need to be having a fund, because when you get when that truck finally meets its maker, you got to have a way of financially replacing that. Otherwise, you're stuck. So a lot of people get caught out because they spend that money initially and they're like, hey, I'm cool. I got all this money, but they forgot that they're just getting the money back for the initial investment of their truck, and they forgot about what it takes to replace it. All right. So then you would calculate that in, and then there's one more thing, at least one more thing that you need to compensate for, and that is the amount of time you need to spend with that client selling the job initially. Now, that's got to be part of your initial cost as well. So that's going to go into your time element because you need to be compensated for that time that you're talking to clients. So this is why many people in wildlife control charge an initial consultation fee to go out. In other words, to show up at someone's house is $149.99, $179.99, $199, whatever the case may be, because it's covering all the costs of being by the phone, driving to the location, doing the inspection, filling things out before they even set a trap. So this is why in the wildlife control industry, free inspections are sort of anathema. That's sort of a theological word, meaning they're accursed. People don't do that. There are some, I'm not saying that there aren't, but as a general rule, wildlife control operators don't like to do free inspections. Typically, when wildlife control operators do free inspections, they're in an extraordinarily high competitive environment. Or I suspect that they are pest control operators who are dabbling in some wildlife control, and they're using the pest control work to subsidize the wildlife control, and they're using the wildlife control work as a lead gainer to get into what they really want to do, which is quarterly service for pest control, is my suspicion. And then lastly, or they are doing it in situations where they can't quote a price over the phone. So typically, wildlife control operators standardize their fees for the common problems. For example, when they're doing something like a squirrel job in a house or a skunk job underneath the deck, those are, it's the same thing, different place. However, when we're doing something like a bird job, bird exclusion, those are far more complex because there's different ways to do the work, and oftentimes companies that are asking for that type of bird work, they're looking for a bid or quote, and so they're not going to pay for that. But those also tend to be high dollar type jobs, and so that's one area where the consultation is going to be quote unquote free. So those are some ideas to think about, but I would strongly discourage people from doing free inspections. And so you need to calculate, what do you need to earn to make it worthwhile? All right, so that takes care of that initial inspection period, that your initial contact the client on the job. Now let's go to the second element of pricing. What do you charge, or how do you charge for the second aspect? There's basically two models in wildlife control. There's the flat rate fee, where you charge the client a flat rate to solve the problem of squirrels in their attic. Or the other option is people charge a setup fee or an initial visit fee, and then they charge a per visit fee after that, which would be some charge on the basis of per animal. Some people charge on the basis of the visit. That is where you need to calculate what that is. And so typically it's a lot less expensive to do the follow-up visits because, again, you already done your inspection. You're spending less time. It's often just grab the trap, replace the trap, remove the animal, put a fresh trap in, whatever the case may be. So you have to figure out what your business model is in that regard. And it's a little tricky. When I first started, when I did my business back in Massachusetts, I was charging an initial setup fee followed with a per animal fee. It worked, not as good as it could be. I mean, hindsight's 2020. I wish I would have done some things differently. When I sold my company, the guy I worked for, he charged a flat rate fee because we did a lot more repairs and exclusion, which is sort of a one-way door system. So he wanted to get, so he was charging clients. We would screen their vents and do a lot more hardening of the building because when we excluded the squirrels, we didn't want them being able to chew back into the structure. So he would rather spend a lot of time on one site rather than driving around from spot to spot to spot. You have to figure out what you want to do and what you're comfortable with. Are you wanting to just get a body count, or are you looking to sort of solve that person's problem in a very permanent way in terms of your pricing? So what are some numbers? So typically you're looking at, if you're charging a flat rate, you may be well into several $100, $400 to $500 flat rate. It doesn't matter whether the person has one squirrel or 500 squirrels. You're there till the problem is solved. And then the next other person, he's charging only on the basis of either a per animal, or some people say, doesn't matter how many animals I catch, if I visit your property, come back again, it's a per visit call flat rate. So it may be $79, $99 to visit. If I have 3 squirrels, then it's $99. Other people are like, no, I get paid a fee plus whatever the animals are, or they charge a per animal fee. Now, the problem with the per animal fee, obviously, is there's no money gained when you come back to remove your traps, which is the other aspect of that initial consultation. You have to remember, if you sell the job, one of your visits, you have to come and you set traps. The last time you come, you're going to have empty equipment as a general rule. So you have to make sure you're compensated for the time it's going to take you to come back and grab your equipment. So you can see how this is a little bit complicated. Sometimes you're going to win some, sometimes you're going to lose some. The key is you want the vast majority of your time winning something. So you want to be sure you think about how many visits you're looking at. So this is where you need to understand how many animals you're going to be capturing. So for raccoons, are you dealing with a lone boar raccoon that may be over a garage attic, or are you dealing with a female with young? So generally raccoons have 3 to 5 young. So are they going to be mature enough for you to trap them individually, or are you going to have to go up into that attic and remove them by hand? What are you going to charge to cut them out of the ceiling if you can't get at them? Or are you going to have to wait till they're mature enough so they can move, or till mature enough where you can trap them? Is your client going to wait for that? Squirrels, same thing. Are you going to wait until the pinkies are going to be big enough to move? Or are you going to trap them all? So how many squirrels could she have? She could have anywhere from 3 to 5. What happens if you're in the mating season and you're catching a lot of males coming in because you're not using positive sets? I talked about positive sets last week. So this is where it gets complicated, but you want to think long and hard about your pricing schedule. Too often, people get into this business, and what they do is they call around to their competition and they just try to mirror their price. That can work, kind of. The problem is that your costs may be higher than your competitor's cost because maybe they have their house paid for. Maybe they have a lower expenses because maybe their spouse is working at a great job and they don't have to pay for health insurance. So you want to be careful of just simply mirroring your competition because as one man said, I don't want to be the low cost person. I want the low. I don't want those jobs. So you have to decide whether what you need to earn to make a go of it, irregardless of what someone else is charging. Because you may have to look at it and say, you know what? I can't compete with these other people. I may need to not do this type of work. Or you may decide, you know what? Ladder work is too expensive for what in my area. I can't really compete with those people. I need to make a higher rate of return. I'm just going to do the ground animals. So it may be better for you as a business owner to be turfing off certain wildlife control activities to another company and maybe get a commission on that. Maybe get a finder's fee on that. So don't think you have to go in and do everything. You have to decide what is making you money. And too often I talk to people who are trying to make a go of it in their wildlife control business, and they would do better working at McDonald's. And the only reason they're not working at McDonald's is because their ego won't let them. And I think that's unfortunate because thankfully those days are past us. But in the earlier years of this industry, there were guys who were working. I said, how are you doing there? I'm working 24/7, 365 a year. And then I would finally, I'm hearing this so often, and I would stop them and then I would say, that's great. Are you making any money? And they would pause. And I would look at them and I would say, you're not sure? And so the point is that you want to be sure you're making money. You don't want to just sort of guess at it. You don't want to have the end of the tax year and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I don't have the money to pay my taxes because I was burning it all up in expenses and I have no money left over for taxes because I was spending it on myself, or I didn't put enough aside and I didn't do good accounting and so I couldn't justify my expenses, or you find out you're just broke. You don't want to be that person just because your ego won't allow you to. So you want to make sure you're thinking strategically about your business. And so let's go over that a little bit more and let's focus again. So you want to find out what your home range is. I call that, that half an hour distance between radius from your location. You can go farther. You just got to make sure you compensate for those other distances. And so I would look at the map and I would say, what communities in that half hour range? And so what do you need to charge for that and get a kind of an average of what it takes to get out there? And then look at the communities that are farther away and say, okay, what's your service call fee going to be for out there? You want to try to keep your pricing schedule simplified because you'll have people calling you up asking for prices and you want to be able to give them a number. And if you're doing an inspection and you're charging for it, give them a real inspection. Give them a report about the condition of their property. So let them know that you're not just coming out there and trying to quote unquote sell them something, although you are. You're giving them value for that particular visit. You're telling them what is wrong with their place. Does the chimney need to be capped? Are there vents that need to be screened? Are there weak spots that need to be secured to prevent wildlife damage in the future? This is where we're a little bit different from pest control. I'm glad to know that a lot of pest control guys are getting into more preventive type stuff, but insects are a lot more difficult to sort of build out in many cases because of their adaptability but with wildlife, people really can, if they follow our directions, they will never have another problem with wildlife in their building in their lifetime. That is eminently possible. And oftentimes when people have another problem, it's because they either made a change in the structure of their house or they didn't take your advice and had certain things done on their property. So that's not the case for pest control, because insects can be brought in a variety of different ways. If you're dealing with high food areas and windows are open, you have flies and other types of things and cockroaches and those things. But when it comes to wildlife, and I'm not talking about mice here per se, I'm talking about things bigger than mice. Mice are a different side of things. But for things larger than mice, you can have a wildlife-free home for like ever, for decades. Let's put it that way. So when you give them that inspection, you're telling them what's wrong with that particular building and what could be wrong, what they could have a problem with out in the future, and what is wrong right now, and what you can do about it. So they're getting a lot for what they're paying for, and you should give them the value of that, and you should and let them know that you're trying to give them a total solution for their property. So that's why you need to price all that in. So write that sheet out, find out what things are going to take you. I know it's tedious. I know it's a pain, but I'm telling you, you need to find out what you need to make in order to make a go of it. Then when you have that number, find out how are your competitors charging? What are they charging? Are you in the ballpark? And I would encourage you to avoid the clarion, the siren call of trying to be the low-cost bidder. The reality is that many times you don't want to be that low cost. A rule of thumb is if when you're giving a price and everyone is saying yes to you, you are probably too cheap. You need to be thinking about it. You should have at least a 10% refusal on the price. And you want to be thinking about what kind of client you want, because it's a whole lot easier. It's a whole lot easier to make money off of a few people and have some free time, as opposed to just being balls to the walls, being the low-cost guy, working yourself ragged. Because this is a business that can really beat on your body. You need to be thinking about long-term stability in this business, because if your body is broken, there's a lot of things that are going to be taken off the table for you. You've got to make sure you take care of your health as part of this work. It feels like a young man's game. We're finding in our industry that as people are getting to their 50s, they can't do what they did in their 30s, and they regret what they did in their 30s. So you have got to be thinking about long term. I think in pest control, it's can be a tough job as well, but it doesn't beat on your body the way wildlife control is, because of the ladder work and the heights and the crawl spaces and the whole 9 yards in that regard. So you want to be sure you're charging appropriately to compensate yourself for the added cost. So those are some principles for you to decide how you're going to do your pricing. But I'm telling you, I can't emphasize this enough. Be sure that you find out what you need to make, what you need to charge to cover what you need to get for your cost structure, so that you can be fairly compensated, so that at the end of the year when you're doing your taxes, you're not finding out, oh my gosh, I've been basically working for free this past year. I'm Stephen Van Tassel for Wildlife Control Consultant. Have a great day.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.